If you rented an apartment in ancient Rome, there was a real chance your building would either burn down or collapse on top of you. And when it did, your landlord would still expect this month's rent. Most Romans didn't live in those marble villas you picture. The vast majority were packed into apartment blocks called insula, islands, 5, 6, sometimes 7 floors of cramped rented rooms stacked over shops on the ground floor. The richer you were, the lower you lived. The poorest people got the top floors, and there is a grim reason for that. These buildings were thrown up fast, cheap, and tall by landlords chasing rent. The lower floors were solid stone and brick. But as the building rose, the materials got worse and the rooms got smaller until the top was mostly timber, mud brick, and optimism. So the higher you climbed, the cheaper the rent, and the more likely the whole thing was to come down. And they did come down. Roman writers complained constantly about buildings collapsing without warning. There were technically height limits. The Emperor Augustus capped them at about 20 meters, and Nero later lowered it, which tells you everything. You do not need a law against something that wasn't happening. If the collapse didn't get you, the fire would. Picture it. Hundreds of people cooking on open flames and lighting their rooms with oil lamps and candles. Inside, a tower made largely of wood, with no running water above the ground floor and one narrow staircase. Fire wasn't a risk. It was a schedule. Rome burned in pieces constantly, and a fire on the bottom floor turned the upper floors into a chimney. This is where it gets properly Roman. One of the richest men in history, Crassus, built his fortune partly on this. He owned a private fire brigade. When a building caught fire, his men would show up and then stand there and negotiate. Crassus would offer to buy the burning building and the buildings next to it at a panic price, while the owner watched the flames. Agree, and his brigade put the fire out. Refuse, and they let it burn. He bought up huge chunks of Rome this way. The first private fire service in the city was, essentially, a hostage situation. Now think about daily life up there. No bathroom, no kitchen worth the name, no running water. You hauled it up the stairs in jars, or you didn't. And human waste went into a pot in the corner which, when full, a lot of people simply emptied straight out of the window into the street below. There were actually laws about getting hit by falling waste and falling pots, because it happened often enough to need a legal procedure. Walking down a Roman street at night was a genuine gamble, so the people on the top floor were paying to live in the most flammable, least stable, hardest to escape part of a building that might kill them. And they were doing it because it was all they could afford. Cheap rent, top floor, and you take your chances. It is the oldest version of a story you already know. The people with the least money get the worst, most dangerous housing and pay a landlord for the privilege. The Romans built roads that lasted 2,000 years and aqueducts you can still walk under today. They just couldn't be bothered to build a safe apartment for the poor. Because the poor had nowhere else to go, and the rent came in either way. Some things about being a landlord have not changed in 2,000 years. Subscribe. Every week, another thing the Romans actually